Hi, Dr. Jenkins here. We are continuing right along, and this chapter is going to be on how nutrition relates to activity. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean someone who's an athlete or plays on a team. This could be any kind of activity. So even if you go out for a walk with your dog, our body reacts a little bit different to nutrition with activity. So here we go. Here are some true and false things. I sometimes like to start things off here. Pickle juice. Can that be used as a sports drink? Pickle juice. What do you think about that? For most people, we have enough glycogen stored in our body to be able to fuel a 20-mile run. What? Do we have enough stored sugar or glycogen for a 20-mile run? And is it true or false that more than half of Americans do not meet the national guidelines for physical fitness? What do you think? At the end of this chapter, we'll go back and I'll give you the answers. Well, I suppose you already have access to the PowerPoint, so you could look, but it might be more fun to stick around and listen. All right, so this chapter, I have to confess, is indeed very near and dear to my heart. I've done 4 Ironmans, yes. It's a long triathlon, 2.4-mile swim, 112-mile bike ride. There I am during the bike ride. That's about mile 60, I think, just over halfway. And then you run a marathon. So one might think that the most difficult thing is the training. But really, the hardest thing, and it's true for a lot of people, is eating enough. How does an athlete, particularly an endurance athlete like that, eat enough to fuel themselves? And we'll discuss that in this chapter. By the way, if I go back, there I am, one of the Ironmans, crossing the finish line. That's up there in Lake Placid. That's been many years ago. But here we go. Okay, so not that you really care or need to know about my own sports stuff, but no matter what your activity level is, some of these concepts are still going to relate. And that's what I was trying to get across at the very beginning. You don't have to be a specific athlete to learn anything in this chapter. All right. Now, we just came off of a chapter that talked about that weight management or weight balance. And even though it isn't always this simple, for our basic level of understanding, our weight is really a product of the balance between the calories that we bring in and between calories that we expend through exercise or just through everyday activity. So this whole chapter is one half of this. We've been spending the whole semester talking about this side. Well, now we're going to spend some time talking about the activity side, why it's important, which I think you know, but we still can talk about it. Hopefully it'll encourage you to remain active if you already are, or become more active if you're not. So this is one half of the whole equation. Here's our outline, and this is another favorite cartoon of mine. I'll pause so you can take it in. All right, here we go. So we're going to start off with some definitions. And as you can see, what I've done is I put things in red that are most important. So more often than not, those things in red are going to be the things that I'm going to ask you to know. Make sure you review the definition for fitness. And I mean, come on, we could probably come up with many different definitions for fitness. Good health or physical condition, result of exercise and proper nutrition. So that's what I really want to point out here. When we talk about physical fitness, we're not just talking about exercise. Part of our overall health and wellness is related to, yes, being active, but also what we eat. And what I want to point out, like I've been saying, for someone to have fitness, They could do a more traditional exercise, go for a run, they could go for a bike ride, they could lift some weights, go for a hike, but you don't necessarily have to look at it only in the terms of a more traditional exercise. Taking the stairs instead of the elevator, going for walks. So, raking the leaves. So we don't have to necessarily get a huge sweat on and go to the gym to be physically active. Something as simple as taking the elevator instead of the stairs, or parking a little bit further back in the parking lot so you can get a little bit of a walk in. Those count. All right. So most of these guidelines come from the American College of Sports Medicine, and the general concepts are good. So when we talk about fitness, we want to make sure that we understand that there's many components. So these are two that you probably already think of for physical fitness. There's endurance, the ability to maintain a muscle contraction or maintain some sort of activity level for a period of time. And then there's more of muscle strength. So there's the ability of a muscle to produce strength to lift something, and that's going to be for a brief period of time. There is something called muscle endurance. So it's different from the cardiovascular endurance. So the cardiovascular or cardiorespiratory, this is more of your heart and lungs. This is the endurance that helps your heart and lungs. Helps your heart to pump out more blood flow, helps your lungs to help you breathe in and out more volumes of gases. But our muscles, in addition to being able to lift heavy things, the muscles have some ability to contract at a slightly lower intensity, but to maintain that intensity, muscle endurance. Flexibility is considered part of this. Our body composition is considered part of this. So we're looking kind of at the whole picture. Just make sure you can identify all 5 of these. I don't need to berate you with all these, barrage you, I guess I should have said. That was the wrong word, berate. I don't need to barrage you with this, but, the evidence is there. Pretty much every single condition, illness, disease, situation, pretty much everything is helped by being fit. Everything. Okay? So you can look through this. What I want to point out in particular is, look at this. It can lower your risk of getting some types of cancer. That's pretty interesting. Of course, it's not going to completely eliminate your risk of getting a cancer. That's largely genetic, passed down from generation to generation. But in terms of whatever your genetic risk factors are, you can still have a little bit of wiggle room there. So even though you might be genetically predisposed, if you are fit, you're going to be a little bit less likely to develop that cancer versus someone who is not physically fit, who has the same genetic family background. All right. This answers one of the questions we had at the beginning. Over half of Americans don't meet their daily need for physical activity. That's true. Over half of the adults in the United States do not meet their guidelines. I'm not surprised, are you? And folks, I think I talked about this in the previous chapter. It's not like everyone is a lazy piece of crap. The way that our society has evolved has made it more difficult to stay fit. We don't walk as much because we use different modes of transportation where we're sitting. Many of our jobs don't require us to be active. We're sitting in a desk all the time. So part of it is just the course of our evolution, but that doesn't mean that we can't still work to be fit. And there's all sorts of health benefits that go along with that. There are many different types of exercise guidelines. We're going to focus on the American College of Sports Medicine, otherwise known as the ACSM. They're more specific than the USDA or U.S. Department of Agriculture. Before we talk about any specific exercise recommendations, keep in mind that There's no one perfect plan for each person. We're all a little bit different. So if you look at an exercise plan that's available, treat it more like a template and not like a etched in gold has to be, because we're all different. All right, here are the USDA's guidelines, and these are a little bit old by now, 2008. How time flies. All I want to point out is we're going to spend more time talking about the American College of Sports Medicine recommendations. All I want to point out here is, according to the government, the USDA, to maintain a healthy lifestyle in terms of activity and exercise, adults need at least 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity per week. So you can break that down, right? You can break that down and do those 150 minutes spread over 3 times a week or 5 times a week. But this is a guideline for about how much activity, walking, running, lifting, whatever, that you would need to do a week to maintain a healthy exercise level. Okay, let's talk about the ACSM guidelines, the American College of Sports Medicine. These are a little bit more specific. Okay, what we're going to see here is, and these guidelines are meant for adults under the age of 65, they include more components. So instead of just saying you need 150 minutes of aerobic activity, the ACSM breaks it down. You need to have some endurance, some cardiorespiratory endurance, but also some strength training and some flexibility. You don't need to know the exact memorization of how many days per week. What we do note, though, if you're interested, is that the cardiovascular stuff we need to do a little bit more often. You know, I think there used to be a thought that the only way to be fit was to go run, or the only way for someone to try and lose weight was to go run or walk for a long time. Well, we're also finding that lifting, resistance training, or specifically things like high-intensity intervals, HIIT sessions, where you stay at a station for like a minute, and each station is different. So you do a minute of jumping jacks, then you do a minute of lifting, then you do a minute of a different lifting exercise. So you're adding in some cardio, but you're also getting the benefits of that resistance training. And especially for women, especially for women who are getting older, who are at risk of having a lower bone density, this lifting component is really important. So in terms of the cardiovascular, so if we're looking at number 1 here, cardiorespiratory or cardiovascular, even though we can see weight loss in other ways, I still contend, and the research still shows, that getting those cardio minutes are still important, right? So I'm still going to say this is most important for losing weight, but it's not the only thing. Ideally, someone who's interested in weight loss should be doing both. Cardiovascular aerobic stuff and also some lifting. If it was all too much at once to start both, or overwhelming to start both, you could have someone start with the cardio a couple weeks and then add in a day of lifting and then go from there. You can see they have a similar guideline for weight maintenance. The U.S. I am blanking. It's been a long week, folks. The U.S. Department of Agriculture. Yes. ADA. Right? What's wrong with me? USDA. I tell you what. We're all human, right, folks? The USDA said 150 minutes for weight maintenance. Well, the ACSM says 90 to 150, so it's similar. But, of course, if you want to lose weight, you got to bump that up. And I'm circling what I'd like you to know. And you can see a note at the bottom. They don't have to be necessarily all at once. They can be broken down. 10 minutes here, 30 minutes here, 10 minutes here, 40 minutes here. All right. So, in addition to just the basics, I've added a couple things to this chapter that hopefully will give you some practical help. This does happen to be an area where I do know a little bit more than some of the other chapters. So my goal here is not to inundate you with information, but it's to try and give you some practical tips. So, case in point, how to start an exercise program. Well, as I said, there's not one right plan for each person, and it can be overwhelming. So here are some suggestions for people who are at this place. Maybe you, maybe somebody you know. You want to make sure that your fitness goals are realistic. No matter where you are or who you are, be realistic. If you've never exercised before, if you set yourself up to unrealistic goals, like if you've never exercised before, you probably aren't going to be ready for a CrossFit competition in 6 months. For me, the Ironman, I trained very well for it, but realistically, I don't have the genetic composition to finish in the top of my age group. So I got to set goals that are within or close to within my reach. If someone's really, really interested in this, it's good to set goals that are measurable. It doesn't have to be like a time. It doesn't have to be like, oh, I did a 7-minute mile today. I'm going to do a 6:50-minute mile tomorrow. It doesn't have to be that. But if you don't set any goals, it ends up being less structured, and it could become so unstructured that you just kind of stop doing it. So maybe your goals are just to do it. Maybe your goals are, I'm going to keep to this program for a week. That's a measurable goal. Because at the end of the week, you check it. So setting goals that are measurable can help hold you accountable and also see your progress or lack thereof. Here are some tips to how to stay motivated. In a lot of cases, exercising with others helps. Doing a variety of things. It doesn't have to be a walk on a treadmill. It's boring. Go for a walk in the woods. Other things that are some key points when you're setting up an exercise program. Please make an exercise program that is incremental. We don't need to be adding 2 miles a week of running when you're just beginning. Way too much. Make sure you build in some kind of recovery. And then give the body a day off, folks, especially for our more seasoned athletes. I mean, think about training for the Ironman. You have so much work ahead of you on race day. It's easy to get into that mindset, I've got to work out every day. Well, if you don't give your body a rest, it's never going to have the chance to repair the muscles. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with the day off or two, and it's actually physiologically necessary. All right, I do want to talk about some training principles. These would be more geared towards our athletes. In terms of that incremental exercise, this is a good rule. When you are incrementally building, the rule is about 10% every 1 to 2 weeks. So you should be increasing your time exercising or your duration. If I start off with 1 mile, I should add 10% to that in 1 week. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it's certainly enough. And we don't want to overdo it, because if you increase too quickly, your muscles are not going to be used to it, and you'll be at risk for injury. You'll be at risk for depressing your immune system longer, a whole host of things. Whatever your training goals are, make sure that your training plan is specific to them. If your goal is just to be more active, well, then just be more active. Go for a walk, set up a group hike with friends. If your goal is to be able to do a pull-up, well, then you should probably be doing some weightlifting that target the muscles that are involved in a pull-up. If your goal is to do a 5K, you should probably be running incrementally to build up to a 5K. And I know it sounds simple, but it's pretty easy to get caught up and then lose the forest for the trees. What are my goals? Oh, well then let me make sure that my exercise plan is actually helping me build towards those goals. Specificity. Here is some other information from the American College of Sports Medicine. You do not have to know this, but this is another resource you could use. Okay. In many instances, it becomes helpful to have some sort of objective measure of intensity. We just talked about incrementally increasing your duration or intensity? Well, duration is pretty easy. I start out by running 1 mile, and then I want to run 1.2 miles, and then 1.4 miles, or whatever. But how do we measure intensity? You could just go off of how you feel on a subjective scale, but that's not the most accurate. So assessing intensity can actually be quite helpful for us. What I just said about rating your effort on a subjective scale is called the rating of perceived exertion. Let me just see if I have it on the next slide. I do. So we're going to talk about that in a minute, rating of perceived exertion. It's easy, but it is subjective, and therefore it's least reliable. What I view as moderate activity, someone else might view as intense, or the other way around. Target heart rate's a great way to do it. Anybody can take their heart rate. They can take their pulse. This is a great way. You can calculate a target heart rate range, and then you can use that range to help when you train. So if you want to do a moderate intensity exercise session, you have that target heart rate range, and you can fill in, well, what would moderate heart rate be? And then take a 15-second break from your exercise session. Take the pulse on your wrist for 15 seconds, multiply it by 4. That's your heart rate in beats per minute. See where you are. Maybe you need to exercise harder to bring your heart rate up, or you can exercise less intensely to bring your heart rate down. Here's the rating of perceived exertion. It is a scale. How hard do you feel like you're working? The official RPE scale, put together by a gentleman named Borg, is a scale from 6 to 20. Starts off at 6, the lightest effort, almost nothing, and 20 would be the absolute, and few of us can get to this point, the absolute most intensely you could ever work. And by the way, why is it on this weird scale of 6 to 20? Well, because if you add a 0, 60 to 200, if I just add a 0 to whatever number I give, that is a very rough, but indeed an estimate of our heart rate in beats per minute. Okay, but it's subjective. The better way to do it would be target heart rate. And we're going to do that later in this chapter. I mean, right now. To find out your target heart rate range, the first thing we're going to figure out is your max heart rate. And you should know this. Your max heart rate is 220 minus your age. Mine is 179. There you know my age. Take the number 220 and subtract your age. This would be the maximum heart rate. You should never go beyond that. Now, of course, like myself, I mean, I'm reasonably well trained, and there have been exercise sessions where I've gotten my heart rate on for example, a really intense sprint on my bike, where I've gotten my heart rate to 180, 181, but that's it, and I'm only there for a short period of time. But it gives us a nice ceiling, because as we age, the ability for our heart to pump out as forcefully goes down. So that's your max heart rate, what you can do within a healthy stress to your heart. And then we're going to find a percentage of that. That's exactly what your target heart rate is. Now, I did this before when I was much younger, and I used that I was 30. So a 30-year-old, 220 minus 30 equals 190. And even though it says you should never go beyond this heart rate, sometimes if you're trained already, it might be okay to hit it every once in a while, but we certainly don't want to go very far above it. And then we usually take a range. A common range is to take between 50 and 80% of max. This would be a decent region to work within, between 50 and 80% of your maximum heart rate. 50% would mean that you're working at half of what you could possibly do, theoretically. 80% is a little bit over 3/4. So this is a moderate to moderately high heart rate range. So if I take 50% of my number, if I take 0.5 times 190, I get 95, and then I take 0.8 times that same max heart rate, I get 152. So based off of someone who's 30 years old, their target heart rate is somewhere between 95 and 152. That's pretty high. It's pretty wide range. But, you know, if you're doing something lower intensity for a long period of time, you're going to be towards the end of that, maybe 120 beats per minute. If I'm doing something really intense for a short period of time, you're going to edge up closer to your max. Here are some suggestions. You don't need to know these, but in case you're wondering, basically to burn fat, you want to be kind of lower and slower in some instances, but you don't have to know that. How to measure this? Well, the first thing you could do, I already mentioned, take your pulse. You could do it at your carotid artery in your neck, or you could take it in your radial artery right above your thumb. Sometimes a treadmill or other equipment will have a heart rate monitor on it. They'll have little silver areas for you to hold on to, and those silver areas take an estimate of your heart rate. They are not very accurate, right? I'd probably take this over the number on the treadmill. And of course, the most accurate is to wear a heart rate monitor. When I bike, I wear a heart rate monitor, right? So I can tell exactly the intensity of which I'm working. Usually it involves like a chest strap, and in the front of the chest strap is a little sensor, and you put that sensor right over your heart. And then you wear a watch, or it goes on your bike computer or whatever, and your heart rate reading will wirelessly go to your watch. But there's also nothing wrong with stepping off the treadmill for 15 seconds, folks. Take your pulse for 15 seconds. Count how many times you feel your pulse go through in 15 seconds. And then multiply that number by 4 to get beats per minute or per 60 seconds. I'm going to give you some examples of exercise programs. You don't need to know these, but what I'm pointing out is that they are incremental. It starts off less and it increases. You see there are rest days. And you see there's a nice mix. This is a sample Couch to 5K plan. Even if we go to the Ironman training program, still going to have a day off each week. And the heavier days would be here, and lighter days mixed in here, lighter. Then it gets moderately hard. Okay. All right, another fun cartoon. Maybe you don't find them so funny, but I do. All right, so now we know some guidelines on what some exercise rules and guidelines are. Let's talk about what we should be eating before, during, and after. Don't forget the basics, folks. Carbohydrates are our first energy source. Fat's what we go to next. But ultimately, we tend to be burning a carbohydrate-fat mixture. And we also know that proteins we use for energy as our last resort. We prefer to use proteins for structure and to make chemicals. All right, I'm going to stop here, and then we're going to come back for the specifics of diet during, before, and after exercise in video number 2. See you then. Oh, didn't mean to do that. See if I can stop this the right way.